Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I had the great fortune to be joined by Dr. Brenda Lynn from CSIRO Land and Water in Australia, as well as Dr. Erik Andersson, who is Professor of Sustainability Science with the University of Helsinki and Stockholm University. They joined me today to talk about green spaces, particularly those in urban areas. We've had previous conversations on BioScience Talks about the value of urban green spaces, whether we're talking about the ecological value or the effects on human health and well-being. But this discussion really gave us a chance to dig into some detail. We talked about how different groups use different types of spaces, and also how planning can be used to achieve urban green spaces that are both well used and equitably used, and also just a valuable part of the urban landscape. But I'll go ahead and let our guests explain, so let's go straight to the interview. All right, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, James.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, just to get us kicked off, I wanted to ask a question, and it's a very general one, about urban green spaces. And in particular, what are they? I think all of us will have ideas in our minds about, what a park in a city might be like. But, what kinds of places are we generally talking about? What's the variety that exists, according to this definition?
So I'll go first. I guess I think of urban green spaces as both all those public urban green spaces we think about, the parks that we hang out at, the areas near the ocean, riverbanks, natural areas and forests in urban areas that we use. But it can extend beyond that to yards, these private areas that certain people have available, rooftop gardens, even peri-urban spaces that are immediately available to city dwellers.
And there is another thing to the urban green. It's a bit different than in many other places. It mixes and meshes with other infrastructures. So sometimes it's more of a hybrid character. We are talking also about novel green spaces, or green and grey spaces, green walls, green roofs. These things that perhaps aren't necessarily seen conventionally as nature, but still have ecological qualities to it. So there's a lot of things that could be called urban green space.
Okay, and I find this next one, very easy to answer for myself, which is, what is the value of these spaces for those who are living in urban areas? For myself, it's very easy to answer that. It's I like walking around, I like hiking, I like taking my kids to the park and that kind of thing. But what sorts of values do people derive from being able to recreate in these spaces, walk through them, or even just kind of be near them?
In a way, that's a hard question because there's so many benefits that come from these green spaces, and it kind of depends on the person, how they want to use the space, what they're getting from it. So in your case, I'm sure you're taking a walk through that space because it's relaxing and enjoyable, right? That you're finding that it's a good way to unwind, or I don't know, what would you say is the reason why you enjoy walking through that space?
I think for me, it's as close as I can get to, a natural area that's near my home. I don't live in a particularly dense city, but I live in, an area that's pretty populous, and I enjoy getting out and seeing a little bit of nature.
But there's a bit of a mix there. So there's what you get from being in nature, but nature is hopefully part of our everyday life. So I'd say, think for yourself, when you walk in the park, do you do it yourself? Do you do it with family, friends? Because quite often what we get out of this experience is also a mix of all the other factors that goes into a visit to a green space. I may be there with my friends, with my partner, with other people, definitely, and of course with the rest of the city inhabitants, the non-human inhabitants as well. So all these things also influence.
People definitely think of green space as potentially either a place to be alone and away from the city. So there's some research that is really looking at how people use it therapeutically as a way to kind of get yourself out of the busyness of urban life, away from the crowds. But then at the same time, other people use it as a way to socialize or feel like they can connect to a community that maybe they want to be alone, but want to still be part of a community. And so there are just so many ways that an individual can use a green space for whatever purposes that they need.
Okay, so I think that gives us a really good overview of some of the different ways that people use and benefit from these urban green spaces. What I'm wondering now, though, is about the way that these spaces are designed. What are the kinds of things that city planners or others do that, set up one of these spaces for success and a lot of use, or perhaps in turn, set it up for disuse and, not being something that's as valuable for the city dwellers as they could be. What are kind of the trends there?
Yeah, it's always incredible to think about how much work went into making a space usable, right? It's interesting. We've done a focus group with a range of park practitioners in New South Wales, around Sydney. And one of the things that came out really strongly from that is that you can't look at a park or green space in and of itself, right? Like a park and a green space might have certain qualities that are great, but it's really that mix of parks and green spaces that are available to you and that you can get to that really help capture what you can do in them, what's available to you, what the benefits you can get. So I think there used to be this lens that if we build it, they will come. If we build a great space, people will really come and enjoy it. But I think there's a more of an understanding now that it's not just about building one space. It's about building multiple spaces with potentially slightly different goals and ideas of ways that people can use it. But it's also about working with communities to understand what they actually want out of the space. What do you need from a green space that's near your house? Is it I need a way that's shaded to get to school or to the bus stop? And is there a nice walk I can do on the way and there's some water fountains? Is it that there are a number of people who are older and want a space to socialize, a safe, clean space somewhere that's relaxing, that provides some kind of ability for them to socialize? So I think really that there has been a big move toward trying to understand what communities need and want, and then help co-design spaces to get to that outcome.
So when looking at a park or any green space, you see a design, you see the management with an intended outcome. So these are highly managed areas, and there's always an idea behind our management. And like Brenda said, green spaces are managed differently and for different purposes and to cater to different needs or audiences. But what goes into planning and design beyond the rather obvious or reasonably obvious kind of type of vegetation and so forth, there is also an institutional design, and this is both at the green space level and at the city level. Which areas are public, which are private, what kind of rights, what kind of opportunities, again differentiating what uses, who can use these areas for what and so forth. And that is not as apparent, but it's usually thought through, you should be thought through, to make sure that there are clear and differentiated rights and responsibilities when it comes to these areas, again, to make sure that different people can find a place and find space for their interests and needs. And then finally, what is done in them also, and this can be done together with communities or for communities, as Brenda said, but there's also programming, which is what you add extra. So there's, as I said before, there's what green space does, but quite often we are cued by other things. There need to be some human presence in there. So of course we provide footpaths, benches, barbecue opportunities, all these other things that kind of indicate what you can do in them and help people read and make use of space. So, and that is maybe the perhaps best recognized among park planners and others, how to both create an interesting green space and also how to queue for these various things. But it is also very important what you do institutionally, and also, like Brenda said, to make sure that this is not just something you do for individual green spaces, but you have a coherent, comprehensive strategy at the urban, like city or metropolitan level, to make sure that you have complementarity among these spaces and not all of them, because it's also a question of what's next to the park. Is it a residential area? Is it industrial, office spaces, whatnot? So if the context of each green space should influence to some extent how it is planned, or what thoughts goes into what could be done there and which functions it's primarily meant to provide. And I don't want to be too instrumentalist there either. So yes, we do try to program green spaces, but I started out in ecology. So for me, it's very important that these are spaces also for other organisms, not just humans. So we shouldn't try to control them too much, but there should be space somewhere in there also for biodiversity in general.
There's something really interesting, I think, also about green spaces and almost like the social cultural rules that we put around it. I think, we as a community for different spaces kind of decide, oh, well, this is kind of a picnic area. It's going to be loud. It's fine, right? Whereas this is a more natural area. This is where you might come for some solitude, for more bird watching or convening with nature. And even, I visited Erik in Sweden, and things I've noticed are even things like social cultural norms around safety. In Australia, there would be a lot of signage to say, don't climb on that, don't do that, don't pick that, don't eat that. And in Sweden, it's a very different social cultural norm around how you interact with nature, with none of the signage. They're like, well, if you want to jump off that rock, that's your choice. It's your responsibility to do it safely, right? So because public spaces are these managed spaces, these risk and liability issues in the background also become part of those social and cultural norms of how you manage these spaces.
I think that is important, because sometimes we think of these spaces as only serving human needs and they should be safe, they should be controlled. But I remember growing up myself, there was just a small, I'm from Stockholm, so I grew up in the suburbs, but still there's plenty of nature and remnant nature left, not just green spaces, but patches of forest, just leftovers from previous land uses. And I was out there having accidents all the time. So again, it seems I survived. And I think that green spaces should allow people to develop a more realistic relation with nature. It's not just there to please us or to serve our needs, but it's just there, and we need to relate to it. And ideally also think through how we behave in it. We can't just use it any way, but we have to respect it in some sense too. So yes, but there definitely are cultural differences, and I'm maybe biased by the way I grew up, but I think it had.
That's probably changed with time too. Perhaps we used to be a little bit more open to risk when being in green spaces or nature spaces, and that level of risk taking or ability to judge risk has reduced with less interaction with more natural spaces. One of the things we're trying to get at in the paper is that as you learn about nature or have a different understanding of nature, what you perceive as maybe not safe or risky or not interactable changes. So, we live in Brisbane, Australia, which is subtropical, and we have pythons in our backyard, and that's just life and nature. And sometimes there's an eastern brown, which is very poisonous, and you avoid them, but pythons are fine, right? And you just have to learn that pythons are fine. They're going to show up. They'll probably eat some rats for you, and that's great. But having that exposure and learning about that is definitely essential to realizing, well, we don't want to kill reptiles, or we don't want green spaces that are natureless. We still want green spaces that have these biological components that allow us to actually learn about nature and ecology and the different biological cycles that actually happen.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. It brings to mind actually a conversation I had with another Australian. We were talking about the various outdoor risks in our respective countries, and neither of these things are actually risky. But I find huntsman spiders absolutely terrifying. They're the size of a cat, and I don't like them, but they're utterly harmless. And likewise, the person with whom I was conversing was saying that wasn't sure he could ever hike or recreate in a place where there were black bears. And now I go out hiking on the Appalachian Trail or something like that, and if I see a black bear, I know that I can clap my hands; it'll run away. It's like a more fearful raccoon in many ways behaviorally, and I think it just does a lot to highlight the differences, in understanding of fear and risk that we have, depending very heavily on what we've actually experienced. And I think it's an interesting point that these green spaces give us an opportunity to engage with nature in that way.
And there is a big difference. So if other studies, we didn't look at it that much, but other studies have shown that if you have experience of nature and if you have already formed an attachment and have understanding of nature, you'll find more opportunities and also have a stronger positive health effect for being exposed to nature. So you're just more attuned to it, better what you can do, and you also perhaps are more receptive to the things that could offer stress relief and other things. So it's not just something we passively take up or absorb, but also something that we can develop. And of course, starting young is easier, but it's never too late.
It also points to the fact that even for adults who might be scared of nature or might be, I don't know, scared of being outside, there are ways to help them be less afraid, right? Like teaching them how to be in nature, how to go for hikes in potentially an area with snakes and spiders, how to be at a park and realize that those bees are not going to sting you. So I think there are a lot of ways to help provide education and programs that help people learn about nature so that they can be in more natural spaces, that they're not only expecting mowed lawns or curated shrubs. And that means that the green space that's available to them really opens up.
That makes a ton of sense. And I was wondering if we could pivot now and talk a little bit about the framework that you lay out in the article that describes, how planners and others can set up an urban green space for success. And it brought to mind as I was reading the article a green space from my own history that was certainly not set up for success. So I grew up across the street from a small park. It was, please forgive the units, 4 acres. It had a basketball court, tennis court, playground, and most important, a soccer field. And the soccer field was very well loved and very well used. And on the weekends, it would just be packed with people enjoying the weather and the air and the game and all that. And it was a lot of fun. But eventually, some relatively small, I would assume, group of stakeholders or somebody got together and had them put up a baseball diamond in that space instead. And they threw up a fence. They allowed half of the soccer field to become completely overgrown, which is great for the deer, but not so great if you're not a deer. And what ended up happening is that the park fell into disuse in a lot of respects. There are still people occasionally playing basketball and things like that, but it's a very quiet place where once it was a space that was much more heavily enjoyed and heavily used. And I'm wondering, how following that sort of framework, planners and others might do a better job than was done, across the street from my childhood home. What would people do if they were kind of planning for those types of spaces the right way instead of, this, which is clearly one of the wrong ways?
Yeah, I mean, when there's a park that people don't want, right? People tell you very quickly and very clearly when there's a park that they don't want. People will stop going there. I think in the end, the park almost becomes uncared for because the community doesn't care for it and doesn't want to put in the time and effort to maintain it or provide, that community feel to it. It's almost like a bit of a divorce, right? Like, oh, you changed, and so we're not in the same place anymore. I think parks do change with time, but you have to change with time based on what people need and what people want. Maybe different parts of the community wanted something different, but then where was the conversation about what was the different aspect of the park that was needed or that was desired. So it would be interesting to look at that and see how that decision was made, because in the end, I think a lot of times these decisions are made a bit too singularly and with only a small group of people. I think one of the reasons, though, is because consulting with a diverse stakeholder group is work. It is not necessarily an easy thing. It's not going to be, oh, we all love this, we're going to want this. It's probably going to be several different groups that maybe want something slightly different. They want different aspects in the park, and they'll be fighting for what they want. And that's difficult, but it's probably a necessary conversation to have. And it's probably good for also a community to know just how diverse people are within their community, what different people want, how different people want to use that space. And it's probably a good conversation to have if they're willing to facilitate that.
And there's another thing, the whole design idea, if the programming is too heavy-handed, top-down, and also too monofunctional or specific, society changes, our needs change. So, and one of the things you have for the potential of open spaces, green spaces, different than much of the rest of the city, is that they are fairly open in their function. You can use them for different purposes or repurpose them. And this is how we've seen parks survive over the centuries, is how their identity and their use has just changed over time. And if you have not put like too strong a stamp on it, as I heard in your example with the baseball fields, it's kind of hard to use it for anything else and also to change it to anything else. But if you have a bit of a mixed open nature, it's relatively easy to change from one use to another. And we've seen this in periods of crisis where much of the recreational spaces have turned into agriculture or just small fields for producing food, had it through the big wars in the 20th century. And I can imagine that it may become more common again in the future where things are a bit more uncertain. So this, with flexing with time and leaving them a bit open-ended in their design. So important to design them together with people, but also important not to over-design or to program too hard, because you need to leave some options or like easy alternatives that could be, or easy ways of changing it into something else to accommodate new needs, new circumstances.
One area or gap that seems to occur in a lot of cities is that there's park design, green space design really thought for younger kids, right? And adults who want to recreate or socialize and picnic. But there seems to be this lack of consultation or thought or consideration as kids become teenagers, right? And one of the things that we talk about in the paper is this idea of affordances, that the way that you want to interact with space as a 3 or 4-year-old changes as you get older, right? What you want to do as an 8 to 10-year-old changes. And then even when you get to those teenage years, right? 12 to 14, 17 years old, how do we actually think about making spaces more flexible so that as kids grow up, they can still see themselves interacting with that space, being in that space? How do we provide programming that doesn't discount that group? Because all of a sudden then they get to university and there's a space designed for university students, right? And for those 20-year-olds and everything. But we really have this kind of this gap in those years of how do we think about and work with them to design those spaces.
Yeah, is it really just a matter of bringing everybody to the table? You know, when I think about the park that was in my neighborhood when I was a kid, the real problem and the reason why the park ultimately wasn't used is because they didn't bring those who were enjoying those, an open field with, that could be used for many different things, but it was often used for soccer. Those who used it for soccer were not consulted. And is it just a matter of kind of getting more people into the mix? And making sure that you're kind of drawing in the largest possible groups, in order to kind of do that planning in a way that's thoughtful of everybody. Is that kind of the key to making sure that the space is actually usable for, broader groups and everybody, rather than just, the few 7 or 8 people in my neighborhood who like playing baseball?
It would help. It's not an easy solution, and I often challenge my planner friends because inviting more people to your process, the planning process or whatever it is, will never succeed because that's a very specific process owned by a specific entity that people may or may not trust. So I would say what you need, if you want to consult or understand people, you need to be a bit more flexible with your processes as well. It's not just being inclusive or inviting people to your process, but also listen into other conversations. Like, these things happen everywhere. Local communities are discussing their spaces too, within families, within groups, whatever. And they're like, the best way of understanding what they want would be to listen to them or come to an event organized by them or something else. So it's not, again, if we impose a very specific process design like planning on a dialogue, it will make it immediately less attractive to many of the groups, and especially like then. Anyway, if you want to listen into people, you also need to understand that different things are said in different fora or in different places. So maybe not always see you as the you, understanding the you in this case as planners, which we aren't, but anyway. But still, you need to be a bit more flexible with how and when you talk to people. And they're talking to more people, and sometimes I'm not sure that convening everyone to the same meeting is the best either, because sometimes these spaces are conflicted or contested. So some of the work I've done, and I'm sure you've experienced the same, Brenda, having research and researchers present can help as well, because we are often understood as less biased or more neutral. So talking to us is not as maybe problematic as talking to your neighbor or a planner. So sometimes we become also mediators, even if that is not the intention of our work. It's still like we're interested in the collective knowledge, and if we can help share it. So there again, it may help if you have some neutral ground where people can meet, and sometimes processes are best served by people not meeting, but still someone collecting their ideas and then presenting them back to the larger group. So yes, more people need to be involved, but just how to involve them and all the different ways you can work with this to make it fit with different local realities is challenging, and is far very different from a regulated, standardized planning process. So it needs a different practice, but it would be a welcome shift, I'd say.
But it seems like from your example too, James, that there's some power in just observation there, right? That, maybe the need for an informal sports field was more important to the community than a formalized space. And so this informal, formal, like do we dictate exactly what a space is, or do we leave it open for people to develop their own idea of what they're going to do with that space? We're going to play soccer one day. Maybe we'll play frisbee. Maybe we'll just picnic and have a big party. I think those things too. If you watch how people are using spaces, what people are enjoying and deciding to do with a space, it gives you a lot of information on what a community wants as well, because they will transform some formal spaces as well to less formal ways of use if that's what they want.
And this is an important lesson too, and especially in times where densification and building compact cities, at least in part of the world, is seen as the ideal. Yes, we can have high quality, small pocket parks, so forth, but just open space, larger open space is different, because it is much more flexible in how it can be used, and also more accommodating in terms of allowing for different parallel uses. So there is a bit of a tension here, and there's been work going into, it's not just like, it's not a linear increase when you scale up green spaces, but larger green spaces are functionally different. So somewhere in the city, within a reasonable distance to where people live, you need also larger spaces. So you can't just improve the quality of pocket parks and other things and believe that you have seen to all the needs people have. And with larger spaces, it's also easier maybe to accommodate more informality or more ways that people can at least take control of a small part of that space and turn it into more of a place for themselves.
I have a good example of informal spaces and how different planners have listened. I have a colleague who works in planning, and one of the things they see in some of these larger parks is that there's always planned pathways, right? But in the end, people will walk the way they want to walk because maybe that's the most direct way from point A to point B, and that's where a lot of people are going. Like, this is the bus stop, that's the train station, they want to go that way. And they've really thought about that when they see like lawn being tread. There's just a path being tread that wasn't a planned path. Well, how do we make this kind of an informal but formalized path now that we maintain it a bit? It's not maybe that concrete path because people still like it, but you start recognizing that this is the way people want to use the space. This is how people are using the space. And you start thinking about, well, how do we redesign or just change the management a bit to accommodate what we're seeing, how we see people using the space.
No, that's a great point, and I think it speaks to the need to be adaptable in kind of managing and planning these spaces as well. I think that would actually be a great note to leave the conversation on, if we so choose. But before I do that, I'm just wondering, are there any questions that I should have asked that I have not yet asked? Or are there any topics that we should hit before we close this one out?
You're asking chief scholars whether there are additional questions.
Yeah, where is more research needed?
Oh, there is plenty more to be said. I think we have had a good conversation, and it does capture some of the maybe the take-home messages is that it's not always as easy, but just because something is complicated doesn't mean we can't work with it, and we have plenty of knowledge how to work with this complexity and turn it into something that is reasonable, attractive. It may take a bit more time, but then again, engagement with people and having more conversations in society is not a bad thing. Well, with the society we see today, I see plenty of need for just talking to people you don't normally speak to.
I think one of the main points that we are trying to make in the paper is really that green spaces and thinking about how humans interact with space, right? It is really such an interdisciplinary topic. We traditionally look at it from that narrow scope or multiple narrow scopes. But if we actually try to look at it more comprehensively, we can probably come up with better solutions to design better spaces that deliver better and more benefits. But it's probably on us to try to bring that together and work with actual practitioners who are making decisions on the ground to figure out how do you do this? How do you actually get different voices in the room and make sure people are represented?
And there's an old and unfortunate dichotomy making a distinction, a difference between city and nature, which I think is a fallacy. The city is nature, and the green is part of the city, and our relation to it is, again, also part of the urban life. So it can't be apart or seen as apart from city. It need to be planned as part of the overall infrastructure and as something that is very much part of people's lives, identities, and so forth. So again, what we've tried to show with the paper is how you can take a more systemic approach to looking at the city, not green spaces as such, but at the city, and then understanding the role of green spaces and people's relation to them in this larger context.
Another point that we're trying to make in the paper is really about power dynamics too. That these decisions are highly based on the power dynamics that are embedded within the system, right? And so part of changing the system is also trying to think, how do you bring more voices in so that the power dynamics can change too, and that there is actually more power given to communities to make some decisions.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely great point, and I think a good one on which to conclude. I'd like to thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks, James.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.